Thank you. Call the meeting to order. First thing I'd like to do is to ask each member or designee for this evening's meeting to identify themselves so that Alan, who's been terrific, can record all of the members who are present in order to make sure that we get the attendance correctly. And Jessica, if you don't mind starting on your side.
Sure, Jessica Casey, Town Plymouth, resident.
Sharon Mello, representing the Old Colony Planning Council.
Joe Coughlin, Town of Plymouth appointee.
John Chapman, I'm the Undersecretary and representing the Housing and Economic Development, please.
I'm Gerard Martin, I'm Master EP representing EEA for Dave Johnston tonight.
Rich Grassy, Town of Plymouth.
Bob Hayden, Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities.
John Giruso, I'm the Planning and Nuclear Section Chief at MEMA, and I'm representing Director Kirschwitz.
Sean Mullen from the Town of Plymouth.
Robert Jones, Health and Human Services.
Tony Provenzano, member of the Board of Selectmen, Town of Plymouth, here for John Mahoney.
Dave Noyes, Recovery Director at Pilgrim Station, sitting in for John Orenberger, Entergy Representative.
Jack Priest, Massachusetts Department of Public Health.
Paul Smith, Utility Workers Union of America, representing the men and women who work at Pilgrim Station.
Joe Lynch, Senior Government Affairs Manager, Entergy, sitting in for Mike Toomey.
Dan Wolf, resident of Harwich, down on Cape Cod, appointee of the Senate President.
And
Kevin O'Reilly, there. Kevin O'Reilly, Speaker of the House.
thank you very much. Did you get all those, Alan? Okay. One of the things that I want to just note at the beginning, Kurt can't be here because he had a death in his family and he's attending that service. I'm sure we all extend our condolences to Kurt and his family for it. And other people I know are making a sacrifice tonight, and particularly Joe Lynch, who had other family engagements but was kind enough to take the beating at home to come and enjoy the beating here. So thank you, Joe, for coming. I want to start by reviewing minutes of the past meetings. We have quite a few to go through. The first is, as you may recall, there had been an amendment to the February 21st minutes. That was distributed to you by Kurt the other day electronically. Is there a motion to accept the amended minutes from our February 21st meeting?
So moved.
Second.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Against? Approved. And while we're going on to it, once again, thanking Alan, who produced all of them for us at the same time. The next one is the minutes from Wednesday, April 11th meeting down at Cape Cod Community College. I didn't catch anything. I read it quickly. I didn't catch anything. Is there anything anybody would like to change or edit or correct to this? Yes.
Sean, can you please add my name to members not present?
Okay.
Thank you.
So, are there any other changes or corrections? I know you just received these two, and we're not on any burden to do it tonight. I'd like to get the minutes done so they can be added, but what's the general feeling? Do you guys want some more time to be able to review them, or are you comfortable enough if there's a motion to accept?
Make a move to accept.
Okay?
Second
To
that.
accept? Any comment?
Joe, I've got one. I noted that Jessica's name was not on two of the minutes.
That's correct.
We'll get to that one then. On the motion to accept, and seconded, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Approved. And Alan, if you caught that, to add Jessica Casey to the, the next set of minutes is from the April 28th, or 26th rather, meeting here at
No, I wasn't.
PCIS. Any corrections or edits, comments? Jessica, you want to add that on that one? Right, Jess? Yeah. So the
Yes,
same,
please.
Alan, to add Jessica to that one?
Thank you.
Any other comments? Edits? Is there a motion to accept?
Motion to accept.
Second. Any comment on comments? Fine. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Accepted. Alan, thank you again. There was a lot of work in a short period of time. I really do appreciate that. The next thing I'd like to just mention, I know there was a great deal of interest at the last meeting and subsequent regarding the budget amendment that had been submitted in the House. And can I borrow one, Tom? Thank you. You've all got a copy, I hope, of the budget amendment that has been filed. And as we get into the rest of the evening's agenda, you'll see that this dovetails very nicely with everything else that we may approve this evening. If anybody's got any questions about this, I've gone through it, but I would suggest you get a hold of the senator. I know he'd be glad to chat with anybody about the amendment. As you can see, it's co-sponsored by Senator Sear and by Minority Leader Tarr. I think it's got a lot of very good things in it, in my opinion. Does anybody want to discuss it? No, hearing no discussion, then it's just noted, and Alan, if you can add it to the record that it's in. I'd like to thank the delegation again for not only their participation in the Cape Cod meeting, but also for their continued efforts and leadership on this topic. One of the things that I wanted to discuss again under the administrative side of it is the open meeting law. Kurt wanted to be here and talk about it, and many of you may have seen an email that we received, the panel received from the Attorney General's office regarding a letter that had been received by the Attorney General's office regarding a whole host of things, not the least of which was the open meeting law. The letter of concern from a citizen also talked about the availability of minutes and other things being posted. Kurt, I know, wanted to talk about it in a general way, but I told him I would take care of reminding everybody what we all know, but it is sometimes difficult, particularly when we're trying to get stuff done, that any correspondence that falls into the category of deliberations, where opinions are expressed and it's going back and forth, is absolutely a violation of the open meeting law. Please do not do it. We oftentimes, and many of our friends are here in the audience, will receive great, well-intentioned information from members of the public and other members of the committee, or the panel, and we respond. At a minimum, thank you, and sometimes more. We have to be very careful of that. We do not want to run afoul in any respect of the open meeting law. So I just wanted to reinforce that one more time. And Joe, if you don't mind, Joe Coughlin, this would be a good point to mention about the minutes of the advisory, I mean, not only of the advisory committee, but all the working groups, and how sometimes there seems to be a lag in getting things posted. And if you mention it, what your experience has been and what we're trying to do, I'll talk.
Yeah, I don't think it's unique to our group, but difficulty we have, as maybe some of the other work groups have, is once we have one of our work group meetings and we get the minutes drafted, is getting agreement to approve them. Typically, we'd have to wait until the next work group meeting to do that. But I think it was the last meeting we had, or maybe the one before that, Kurt had mentioned that he had explored that with, I don't know whether it was EEAGC's office or AG's office or whatever, but offered a couple of little options, one of which was, I believe, that if the work groups would agree to give the chair of the work group the authority to approve the minutes, then they didn't have to wait for their next monthly meeting to approve them. They could then, once that was done, they could then send them in to the co-chairs to get them posted as is required by the open meeting laws. If in fact my understanding of that is correct, that would be very, very helpful, certainly helpful to my work group. Another question has arisen, however, in that same regard, and that's if you've got a limited number of members to the work group like we do, we only have 3, and one of them has to abstain. With the two left, with two being a quorum for three, can the chair vote as one of those two, since the chair is one of the three in total? So if the chair votes to approve them and the, one of the other members votes, is that okay to then sort of constitute either a quorum or just give the chair the authority? In our case, what I have suggested to our panel members, neither of whom were able to make it tonight, but discussed it with them recently, is that if they'll give the chair the authority to approve the minutes, it'll be after the draft has been discussed. If we've had any problems with it, let's bring the problems out, we'll resolve them. And then if any of the members wants to abstain, we'll note that in the minutes that the, notwithstanding the chair sort of finalizing, so they move forward with a list. There were, let's just say it's 2 votes for and 1 abstain. The abstain is not a vote, it's just an action, but it would be so indicated on the minutes. And if that's all okay, we'd like to be able to proceed with that, because there's a crying need to get minutes posted on that website. And put a little plug, maybe after June, when we get done with the annual report, we can get back to that website, because there's a lot of documents that need to be posted on there in a resource section, and that hasn't happened yet.
Thank you. I think first, the chair will make a ruling this evening, the co-chair, that it is absolutely fine, because I've discussed this with Kurt, it's absolutely fine to take the approach you're taking, if the other members have agreed that once a draft is distributed, to do it. The other thing that's difficult, and for those of you that saw the correspondence through the Attorney General's office to the panel, is the frustration that some members of the public, and obviously concerned citizens, have voiced that there appeared to be a little lag time. And one of the problems is it's all volunteers. And Kurt actually does have a real job other than what he does for us, as does Alan and the other state folks. So it's very difficult just to keep up with it. And I haven't met this gentleman, Mike Orchid, yet, but I think he works for us. I mean, the amount of materials that are being forced into there is increased precipitously as the work groups have. So I just ask everybody to understand that everybody's doing the best they can at the moment. I think we'll get some very good corrections to this in the near future. We'll talk about that in a minute, but thank you, Joe. And if there's any other work group issues like that, let me know. Which is a nice segue into this other list of work groups. Kurt and I have spent time periodically trying to make sure we get this updated. If there are any corrections to this list of who's on the work groups and who's the chair at the moment, please write them out, give them to me tonight, and Kurt and I will take another pass at that to get that updated so it's accurate. I know that at least one person has sent me a note today saying that they think their work schedule will prohibit them and they may have to step down from one of them. But until that happens, I won't update it. Any other comments on the work groups?
You might want to list Dave Nichols as the chair of the government
Okay.
community relations.
Correction number 1. Any other obvious corrections that need to be made? Okay. Hearing none, we'll just go on to the next topic.
Sean, I've got
Yes,
just
sir.
one comment.
Oh, yes.
I'd like to make a recommendation for consideration, and that is, at our monthly meeting, I would be very interested, maybe others would be as well, to hear a very quick update from each of the working groups as to what they're working on, what their progress is, what their problems are, maybe 1 or 2 minutes. I know, I have an idea what Joe does. I don't have an idea what Mr. Nichols does or where he is. For example, on our findings and recommendations, a lot of our recommendations crossed over each other. Some of our recommendations, for example, on the Safety and Security Committee had only to do with safety and security, whereas others were dealing with environmental issues, radiation standards, stuff like that. And it was sort of like, you know, it was a free-for-all.
Yeah.
And that's okay, because everybody's participating, but it would be a good idea if we had just a short amount of time in the beginning to hear how each working group is doing.
I personally think that's a great idea, Rich. Any other comments on it?
So that's, yeah, that, to add, I agree with you, Rich, and that's another reason why it's so important that we have the ability to get the meeting of our minutes posted. Then we can see what the discussions are with each of the work groups, but they're taking forever to get posted.
Here's what my suggestion would be. With the consensus of the group, if I hear no dissenting opinion, I'll take it as a consensus. I'll add 5 minutes on
That's all.
in July,
Yeah.
starting with the July meeting, as a regular part of the agenda, to make sure that each group gets an opportunity. If it's
Right.
only 2 minutes, only two, whatever, but we'll add 5 minutes on. Speaking of the July meeting, if we go back to the original, and I know Joe Coughlin and I have talked about this in the past, I'm of the opinion that there's a whole new set of topics that once we get through this annual report. So, for example, the invitation to Holtec that we've talked about bringing in. I'd like to just take a few minutes now, because we've got about 5 minutes still in the schedule, to talk about who do you want me to try to line up for us post this first one. You know, so Holtec's one of the obvious ones. I'd like to hear anybody's ideas at this point. Any thoughts? Well, hearing none, would everybody think that Holtec would be a good group to bring in?
Oh, yeah.
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 I think
I've got a suggestion, Sean.
Yep.
And Dan and I have spoken about this, and one of the issues that Dan and I have spoken about is the lack of expertise, not necessarily on the panel, not to slight any of the people from Entergy or anybody from one of the state agencies, but to the extent that we can identify people with expertise that we could screen maybe, that eventually when we get to either a funding situation or a situation where we need to bring in outside expertise,
Yep.
for the working group areas in particular, identify an individual that we could bring in to talk about those subjects.
I think when we get to the latter portions of today's meetings, you'll see an avenue to that.
Okay.
If it goes the way I think it's gonna go. You'll see an avenue to that. What I'm thinking more at this point, Rich, is that there's subject areas that I think we all have. And I'm just gonna, since I'm looking over at Jess, we haven't devoted much time yet to the economics of what's going on. We certainly, in my opinion, haven't devoted enough time, although Joe's been great, Joe Lynch has been great about setting out the first steps about the employees and what's being done. Entergy's already out in front of that. I think we talked about it briefly, to have one presentation just on the folks that are there and how we're gonna help mitigate that. I'd like to suggest that we have 3 topics, because it takes me a while. It takes usually about at least 6 weeks to coordinate this kind of stuff. That without cutting it in stone this evening, to say, maybe a presentation from Entergy, similar to what you've done up in Maine on the employees, if we could put that on for July. Put Holtec on for we don't do August, so September. And then another topic for October, just so I can start getting it in the pipeline and get those dates nailed down with people. So would those first 2 be fine, and anybody's got another suggestion? Yes, Jack.
I'd like to have the NRC come back and have a discussion on their revised decommissioning
Great idea.
regulations. What's the change from the last time that they briefed us? What do we expect to be at June 1st, 2019?
Let me ask Joe. Joe, what's the timing on that?
November is when they told me, when I talked to them in Washington, that is when they're planning to come out with their notice of proposed rulemaking that will reflect the January analysis document and then the last November's regulatory basis document. So all that is, however all that shakes out, it's supposed to come out in November.
So we could ask them if they'd like to participate in November, if they're ready at that time to discuss that proposed rulemaking?
Yeah, I would absolutely, and they've been great. Every time I call, they're very responsive. Would November be too soon for them, or would it be better to ask them for December?
I think we could ask them
We
if
can
that would be
ask,
too
yeah.
soon for them.
No meeting in December.
Right, that's
Or
right.
January.
Yep. No,
'Cause once-
January we do meet. December.
Whenever that comes out, then the
It's
panel's
August,
gonna have to
yeah.
make a decision as to
No
whether
December,
it
yeah.
wants to submit comments to the executive branch so that the executive branch can decide whether they want to submit comments to the NRC.
One of the folks who is not present tonight because of a conflict mentioned to me that they would very much like to see the folks from UMass that did the economic analysis come in. That would be an ideal one, say, for October. Does anybody have any thoughts about that?
Should have it.
Okay. So again, these aren't cut in stone. I got taken to the woodshed once already on this topic, and you know who's laughing. I'll try for the UMass out on October. Yes, Joe?
On the Holtec, if you do get them, if you could get them to focus not only on the different types of storage casks, the life expectancy of them, what happens if there's a leak, a break, a crack, as has come up before, and then also the status of these storage facilities that are being talked about in Texas and in New Mexico, as to where they are and what the future of those looks like.
And also,
important to us.
I know that Joe Lynch, again, I'm not to pick on him and compliment him too much, but we've talked about the transportability of these things. And they're the better ones to talk about that, because they're the ones building it. So as we get closer, I'm gonna shoot for getting him in September. Joe, yeah, I know you nodded, but that might just be, you know, you're all set for July? July would be good for the presentation on the employees and the local?
Yeah, absolutely.
July. All right, so we're covered pretty much then through the end of the year, what I'll try to do. And I'm trying, don't yell at me, I'm so sensitive.
You want to fill in one?
Yes,
You want a bullpen?
yeah,
How about somebody from Senator Markey's office? He just is sponsoring the legislation on storage, on-site storage, and changes that he's proposing with the duration that they could be stored on-site and things like that.
If we do that, I don't know if you all saw it, but Representative Keating had a little bit of success last week getting admitted. One out of the 3 amendments that he added on, so one, with everybody's
Either
permission.
one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll put on the elected federal guys again. I'll figure out where we slot them in here, but I'll put that down. Any others before we get back on schedule?
Just a point of clarification.
Yeah.
On what Joe mentioned about open meeting with the notes of meeting. Did you say you talked to Kurt? And
Kurt and I had talked.
it's okay for the chair to approve it?
My understanding from what Kurt said was the same thing that Joe just said, which is that if the panel, the working group, agrees that the chair can do the minutes,
Then it's okay.
subject to
Okay.
giving them the draft beforehand to expedite it. That's what Kurt told me, that's what Kurt
Right.
told, then I'd say the ruling is for the moment, go ahead and proceed, subject to.
Okay. I just want to make sure that was closed.
Sean, if you're willing to accept one more bullpen.
Absolutely.
Mass DEP, Western Regional Office, Mike Gorski, his unit did an excellent presentation in Vermont a year and a half ago about their experience at Yankee Rose decommissioning,
Yeah.
so something they may be willing to do at a future meeting.
Yep. I know he would, so. Okay. Any others? Yes, Pat.
Sean, could that be added to the financial and economic group, subgroup?
The
Could that
UMass
be
piece?
added to
Oh,
it?
yes, absolutely.
Okay.
There aren't many new faces in the audience, but for those that are new, you'll see that this is in fact a working meeting, not a public meeting. Okay. Any others? Okay, then let's move on to the next agenda item, which is the review of the draft annual report. I emailed you all a copy of this. It's in Word format. You'll see that on each one of the pages, it says a big thing, sample. It is not meant to be anything more than a sample. However, that being said, it's all laid out. We can absolutely comment on it from an administrative point of view without getting into deliberations. I know, Rich, you had a thought about the cover, for example, that you might make some changes to the cover. The format of it is in a Word format, so you can add pieces. And the way I've designed it, as we've discussed, there's some basic building blocks of it. There's the membership, there's the acknowledgements, there's the summary, there's the intro, there's the usual stuff that goes into this kind of report. The only thing I'd request is that as you begin adding stuff into your version, just put a version number on it for you, whichever group or person that is, and keep the typeface the same. Don't go fooling around with the formats, because it'll give me fits. And if that's acceptable to everybody, and understanding this is a sample, the contents are just there. So instead of using that crazy Roman stuff, that I actually put in real words that somewhat make sense. Maybe not perfect sense, but, so I hope we all will write to this in Word, and here's my fond desire of what will occur with this, is that the working groups, by June 5th, whatever initial passive stuff you want to submit into it, send it to me and Kurt, and I will start building the document by June 5th. So that when we come to our extra meeting again, and we're getting together a lot, it seems like lately, on June 7th, I will have prepared and distributed back to you an electronic version of what's been rolled up to that process. So it'll be an iterative process, and that'll give us all a chance to catch it, catch edits, typos, comments on June 7th. If we can accomplish that with what we come out of our June 7th meeting of, is my hope is that I will email you the next draft, the next iteration, version 3. I'll email you that on June 15th, so that by June 18th, prior to the meeting, giving us all 3 days to look at what we probably will have already looked at mostly, then I will email you back the next roll-up of it. So that hopefully, by the June meeting, June 20th meeting, we'll have a third version that we can really dig into. Now, whether or not we get it approved at that meeting is subject to how much we get done in the meantime. But the way I'm looking at this, and my suggestion to the group, and the way I designed the document this way, is it's not fill in the blanks, but it's stay true to the form. That you will write what the committees have already, the working groups have already done. And I mean, we've got the great minutes already, and I've got a separate piece that I've already drafted. You know, who have all of our speakers been? What did they talk about? Which attachments? The document, I'm not sure how long it'll come out to be, and there'll be obviously some footnotes to attachments and all of the presentations we received. But that is my goal and work plan, and I would like your comments on it, whether I'm out of my mind, whether it's not realistic, or whether this is a workable process through June 20th to see if we can get it done. Yes, Richard?
I'd like to volunteer my time to help you. if you
I would be delighted. You write very well, too. Anybody else? Any thoughts?
Question.
Yes, sir.
The outline that you've got, the sample outline for the work groups, I suspect the bulk of that information you already have. And I know for our work group, I'm gonna be out of town starting Saturday and won't be back till early June. So there's nothing new that I would
Add to it.
Send in, add to it. I had sent you and Kurt a copy of our most recent minutes
Yes.
today.
Here's my dilemma. I don't mind spending the time, especially when I'm traveling, of just rolling it up. But I don't want to be presumptuous for what the working groups or individuals might want to do by simply taking it and dumping that in. So it's a balancing act. I mean, I don't mind being the clerk of the works and the assembler of this, but I don't want to speak for you in the document. So if, for example, and this might be a suggestion that works for everybody, if you want me to take what has already been written in the minutes and in the mission statements and in the recommend, I will be glad to put that into the format and then turn it back to you, hopefully on June 5th. I have no problem doing that, but
Problem is, I'm gonna be out of the country, so
Yeah.
I don't have any time to do anything more. And since I'll only be back the day before you'd like the input, I don't have the time.
well, Pine writes very well, and I can abuse her. So,
She's got her own work group
Yeah.
also.
Yeah, and John writes well, so.
Point
Please.
of information, considering the audience,
Yes.
I rather enjoyed everything very professional presented here, and, you know, it's got enough recommendations so that can be digested. You know, I
Yeah.
might not agree with them all, but it's, whereas in the particular working group I'm on, we must have 24 recommendations that are continually being argued and not necessarily approved by the majority. It wouldn't be your intent to just take them out of the meeting minutes and
Absolutely
put
not. If it wasn't
okay.
approved, it's not, it didn't happen. It was discussed, but
So it might well require some of your time and subjective judgment.
I think it will, and I welcome anybody that would like, and for those of you who've never been in my office, it's very comfortable.
Right.
Milk and cookies are almost always available, so. Any other comments on this? Any other thoughts, suggestions?
Just to let you know, Sean,
Yeah.
the Vermont Yankee, the first NDCAP annual report was only 15 pages.
Yep.
They covered a lot of the statutory basis for their existence up front.
Yep.
For those who are not aware, they had listings of the members. I think you do too. I haven't got your outline before me. They talked about the Nuclear Decommissioning Trust Fund. They listed all the meetings. But then because the decommissioning had already started, they got into some serious stuff fairly soon, and we've got another year.
Yeah, I mean, my thought on it, and it goes to Paul's point as well, is that if we can start rolling up an iterative version-based document, that we all have some time to have bites at and changes, if we don't make June 20th, we've done a great job already, guys, considering what we had for recess. And it comes out in July, it comes out in July. If it's 13 pages or 21 pages, it doesn't matter. It is what it is, and we'll put it in. But I want everybody to have at least 3 bites at the apple to say, no, I don't agree with this, and let's talk it out and have everybody vote on it.
That's what I'd suggest to Joe, is to put it in there with what you've got, and it's easier to take stuff out than it is to try to think of what else do we want to add.
Excuse me. Should have shut that. Okay. Hearing none, we're right on schedule. Yes, sir.
Just one point. To the degree that it can include a roadmap going forward, I think it should.
Yeah.
More relative to process, but, you know, at sort of expectations of what's gonna happen when from this group.
Yep.
Because I think perhaps the most important thing in this first report is to really set expectations relative to process going forward.
Just make myself a note, Senator.
And I would talk to you more offline about it, but that would be a violation of open meeting law, so.
Only if we're talking about the substance and deliberation, not if we're talking about putting another footnote in.
Okay.
So, hearing no other comments, we'll move on to the next agenda item, which I'm sure is highly anticipated. The next agenda item is the discussion and panel votes on the proposed findings. And I'm going to call on John Chapman to join me here at the end of this, but at the moment, what I'd like to do is give you some introductory comments. I know many folks were, a little confused at the end of the last meeting because of the votes that occurred, and I think rightfully so. Many folks, particularly the state folks in Entergy, felt they needed more time to digest and consider what the recommendations were. Everyone agreed that, this meeting would be the time that they would do it. And I can tell you, and I want to say a couple of things from a personal point of view, that there's been a lot of work that's transpired among many people since that last meeting to make sure that everybody had an ample opportunity to fully reflect and think about and present their ideas. The end summary of that is the revised that has been compiled. It is essentially a condensed version of the 6 recommendations from before into 4. There is a great deal of wordsmithing in it, but no change, dramatic change, no significant change in the overall content or intent of the recommendations. Only because I played a role in this, I would really welcome a motion to just accept them all without debate. That being said, we perhaps want to talk about them, but before we do, I just want to give you my personal take on this thing. I think I may enjoy the status of being the closest resident to the facility that's on the panel. And I've never had any questions about the intent of anybody involved in this thing. But since Pilgrim Nuclear started and was built in '72, I think the actions that we may take tonight, and I'm not overstating this, are the single most important and significant actions since the plant was built and came online. I really do. When we read the recommendations, when John and I talk a little bit about the administration, this is dramatic. This is truly, what we're talking about doing tonight is not only a model for Massachusetts, but it's a model for the nation. The level of cooperation and collaboration among Entergy, the state, the panel, I think, quite frankly, Joe could maybe talk to this more, and Paul from other experiences, I think it's unprecedented in this era of deregulation. The leadership, and this is something that, I've been around this kind of thing professionally for 40 years. I have never seen the level of leadership from Governor Baker and Lieutenant Governor Polito to Senator DiMacedo, Senator Sear, Representative Muratori, Representative Peake, the entire delegation. I have never seen this happen the way this has happened. And I just want to take 2 minutes and go back to the beginning, because everything has a start. If it were not for Senator Wolf, in my opinion, and Senator DiMacedo, who's not here, we wouldn't be here tonight. We wouldn't be about to accomplish what I truly believe is an outstanding accomplishment and a model for the nation. We wouldn't do it. So, Senator, personally, and I think the panel would agree, thank you and thank Senator DiMacedo for what you did to begin with. But then you got to thank my co-chair, Kurt Schwartz. Kurt has played an incredible role over the last 3 weeks in trying to build a consensus in getting us all on the same page with where we should head with this. So I think if I can only leave you with a couple of things before we start discussing and voting on the recommendations, is that thanks to the leadership in the corner office, thanks to Senator DiMacedo, Senator Sear, Senator Tarr, a whole bunch of people, thanks to Kurt Schwartz, we're here. What we have in front of us is truly a remarkable set of recommendations that I think is going to change it. So with that, I'm going to briefly turn it over to John, and then I'm going to make some final thoughts before we start working on it.
No, I want to thank you very much, Sean. I've been asked to speak tonight on behalf of the administration since Kurt unfortunately cannot. He's much more eloquent and much more qualified to do it than I. But I just wanted to sort of echo really a lot of what Sean has said. A lot of work has gone in the last several weeks, and great leadership, just like you said. A lot of hard work by you, Sean. I know you've taken the spotlight away from you, but you worked extremely hard at pulling together these particular recommendations or condensing them and really making them workable for everybody involved in this effort. I think it's important for people to know the role that the administration plays and the role that the members of this panel play from the administration. Obviously, I represent economic development. We have DPH, we have DPU, HHS. I know I'm missing somebody, DPH. EEA, which is the most important, because they've been the lead of all the agencies. But we're not here on this panel because of our expertise with decommissioning of power plants. But we're here to sort of speak to or to bring the resources to bear from our respective agencies. And I think that that's what has sort of come out of all of this. It's clarified our role and where we need to be. And on behalf of the administration, that I'm saying thanks to you, Sean. A great deal of thanks goes to our legislative delegation, both state and federal, and of course all the panel members, because this hard work that everyone is doing is going to get us to the right place. We are setting a precedent tonight for leadership nationally in this type of effort. And I think just on behalf of the administration, I want to thank everyone. And I know I'm trying to cut the conversation short too. We have to hear from folks and hear their thoughts, but see, and now the microphone's been turned off. Am I timed out? But I really like what I see here. And on behalf of the administration and our state agencies, I would recommend that we support the hard work that Sean and the legislative delegation and state agencies and representatives from them have done here.
Thank you,
So thank
John.
you very much for the opportunity to speak.
And I'm not gonna put anybody from the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs on the thing, and those were very kind comments, John, but let me just give all of you an insight that Kurt shared with me last evening, and perhaps David's stand-in can elaborate, but I think it's fair to say that what's going to happen, and this is no short amount of leadership being shown, is the administration's gonna form and convene a multi-agency, interagency working group, led by Secretary Beaton, and the EEOA, or I can never get it's EOEEA, I can't never get it right.
Or EEA in short.
Yeah, EEA in short, that's the way the website is, because I can't get it. The intention is to hire outside consultant with expertise in this area. It's also that the meeting will be formed and in consultation in conjunction with Entergy. The understanding is that as soon as it's all put together and everybody's on board and it's under the direction of the secretary, that there'll be meetings beginning as soon as possible with Entergy to discuss putting together a comprehensive agreement between the Commonwealth and Entergy. All three of the groups have been at the table. Everybody's been talking. Everybody's in agreement. It's just, to me, a year ago, I would never have guessed that we could have come this far. And it really is to the tribute of everybody else. So with that, unless there's any other comments, hearing them? Yes, Senator.
Yeah, I want to echo Sean, I think your leadership has been a key role of it. I can say that when we envisioned the legislation, setting this body up, this is exactly where I think we hoped it would be, which is full engagement from the executive offices. And John, I want to thank, through you to the governor and the rest of the executive branch. It's the beginning, though, it's not the end.
Absolutely.
And what we were hoping was that there would be a structure and a commitment to give the citizens real information and a real voice at the table through the process. And I totally applaud your leadership, because I think you've been steering this in a direction where we are going to have a voice, and the citizens will, and there is engagement and resources and a commitment of that. So I think, again, we're at the beginning of a process, because
Yeah.
we're going to be participating. One of the things I love about your recommendations here is that they engage this committee too, to the
Totally.
degree that we can be.
Yep.
So I want to thank you for your leadership on this.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So on to recommendation number 1. Any discussion on it?
Just to point
Yes,
out,
Paul.
sometimes I miss things. So what I understand then is that this is already de facto in
No,
place.
No.
it's not at all.
Oh, it's not?
No, well, these are recommendations that
I
will
know
be
that.
contained in the report.
Yeah.
But I was just speaking to the process that the state agencies were all involved with the process.
Already.
Under the leadership of Secretary Beaton and EEA. We've all been brought to the table and been part of this discussion, including the leadership of Sean and the legislative delegation, just to make sure that we have a process in place going forward. So these are just recommendations, and we're just speaking about these now, and look forward to have your comments as well as others.
Okay, so,
Point of order.
Not yet. Point of order come from the members.
My question, I simply asked a question.
Yeah.
Since none of us have seen any of these recommendations, could we at least ask that they be read before they're voted on?
Oh, sure. If we have some extra copies, we'd be glad. Do we have any extras left?
Yep.
We'd be glad to distribute them, Jim, if we have extra copies. Thank you, Paul. So I will read for the record then, to make sure that everybody hears it. Recommendation number 1 is the NDCAP recommends that an interagency working group be established within the executive branch to monitor the pre- and post-shutdown decommissioning process at Pilgrim Nuclear Power Station, PNPS, and to lead and coordinate state agency involvement in any matters pertaining to the plant's decommissioning within the respective agencies' jurisdictions. The NDCAP further recommends that one agency or department and one individual within the agency or department be designated to lead and coordinate the working group and serve as the primary liaison between the executive branch and the NDCAP and other stakeholders on matters pertaining to the decommissioning of PNPS. That is the recommendation. Any comments on it?
I don't see how anyone could not find in favor of that.
This is, in my opinion, Paul, you're a genius, and that's correct.
And that sounded like a motion.
Is there a motion to accept recommendation number one?
So moved.
Any second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Passes unanimously. Let the record show. Recommendation number two, the NDCAP recommends that it necessary and appropriate, the general court appropriate sufficient funds to the executive branch to enable the interagency working group and state agencies in FY 2019 and subsequent years to effectively monitor and work on the decommissioning of Plymouth Nuclear Power Station, including hiring or retaining appropriate administrative and technical support as needed. That's one of the reasons why I distributed Senator DiMacedo, Senator Seer, and Senator Tarr's budget amendment. Is there any comment on number two? Yes, sir.
Yes, because the recommendation doesn't state the source of the funding, and the source of the funding I find hard to follow because it's an amendment to an existing bill. Our concurrence on recommendation number two saying, yes, recommendation number one has to be funded, but it'll be funded by the state. It's not coming from the town of Plymouth. Yeah.
That's why the general court is there. The funding that's envisioned and what the intention of both the legislation proposed by the senators as well as the intent of this recommendation is to say, again, we're all on board on the same point, is that the legislature has got to come up with some money in order to do this properly.
Right.
That's what the recommendation is. It's as simple as that. Now, we have an expert here in this matter, in Senator Wolf, that you've seen how this proceeds in the past. We may get it, we may not get it, but I will tell you, now that there is unanimity of opinion, we are much more likely to get the support. Now that we've got broad bipartisan support, we're much more likely. But there's no guarantee, Paul.
And also revenue is exceeding, I mean, right now, the revenue looks better than it has
Yeah.
in any of the time that I was in there, so I should have left earlier, I guess. But actually, there is some discretionary, I think,
Yeah.
budget money there, and hopefully it'll go to this.
But the subtlety of my question, maybe it's not so subtle, okay, is that by voting for recommendation number two, we are not suggesting taking money from the decommissioning trust fund.
No.
That would take it away from Plymouth or
Absolutely
from
not.
the members we represent.
Strictly the general
All right.
fund.
All right.
That's, any other questions or comments on recommendation number two? Hearing none, is there a motion to accept?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Again, motion, recommendation number two is approved unanimously. Recommendation number three, the NDCAP recommends that the general court, with input from the NDCAP, the interagency working group and other stakeholders, develop and enact legislation as necessary and appropriate on matters such as, but not limited to, the Commonwealth's Decommissioning Oversight Authority, decommissioning radiological and environmental standards, off-site emergency preparedness, and funding site restoration, ongoing environmental and radiological monitoring requirements and standards, and ensuring that entity and its successors have and maintain sufficient funds to complete the decommissioning process. Any comments or thoughts on number three? Yes, Joe?
I have a question as to the intent of the meaning of the word oversight.
I was gonna ask the same thing.
I can only tell you, from my perspective, I can't speak for everybody involved, but from my perspective, it goes back to number one, that there is a designated organization, in this case, Secretary Beaton's office, that will have responsibility for having that specific activity over there. You know, they'll be looking at it. So I think for the purposes of this first recommendation, and this might be a good point, Alicia, to give you some thought process on this. Our job doesn't end with these first four recommendations. The working groups, the continued advice that'll be provided, which is why you'll see the NDCAP and other stakeholders are continually involved in. I think the intent of saying oversight is let's not get too specific right now, and let's let this working group and the administration figure out exactly what's the best way to act on behalf of all the Commonwealth citizens.
And if I can just add a comment, I was just going to say, I think these are purely just recommendations, and they will evolve, and nothing is set in stone.
Yep.
And I think that we've discovered that this is a process that we are continually becoming educated along the way, and we're perfecting it to be the best process it can be. So
And
I
again,
just wanted to
yeah,
add
that's a
that
great
comment,
point,
so I
John.
think that's what the thought is.
And again, and I can only speak for myself on this, the level of cooperation and collaboration that I've seen from our folks at Entergy is very, very good. And this is not an adversarial thing, this is everybody's trying to do the right thing here, so.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah. Yes,
Just one comment on recommendation 3. This came up at our Government Affairs Working Group the other evening, and that was, is there a place in these recommendations for economic impacts, or is that addressed somewhere else?
It was not in these, and if we want to amend it to say that, I don't think anybody involved is gonna have much heartburn about that at all. So if we want to put a comma after something, and economic impact, comma, I don't
Well,
think.
I'd rather stick to what's written down.
I know we would, yeah.
Today.
And add a
But-
separate
but,
recommendation?
Not a separate recommendation, but know that I'm the economic development representative on the panel, so certainly those interests are here, and I am the mechanism to gain resources to parts of the state agencies to assist in identifying what the right path is to take. I think it's presumed, and it's,
Okay.
and with my representation here, I think you're covered.
I'm good with that.
The language says as, but not limited to.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes,
Senator?
That's right. Yeah, exactly. I was gonna say that. I was also gonna say, when you read it, there's that song in Hamilton where like the comma is put in the place and it changes like the whole meaning. What you actually read was off-site emergency procedures and funding site restoration.
Yeah.
And that's actually not what it says. It says emergency preparedness and funding,
Comma, yeah.
site restoration.
Yeah.
So it's not that we're talking about funding site restoration,
Right.
or are we?
No, we're not, it's comma.
Okay.
Thank you.
Look for more conversations with you, Kevin.
Paul and then Joe.
If I could, I'd like to hear from our legislative representative, what is envisioned by this enact legislation? We didn't need legislation to decommission Yankee Row, and that's kind of the gold standard, and that's right here in Massachusetts. So what is this legislation gonna consist of? Because the last one we had was deregulation, and we didn't do so well with that, so. yeah.
Agreed. Yeah, I mean, I would actually defer to the executive branch. What I will say is that it's really common through the legislative process that in a healthy environment, the executive branch is working with the legislative to come up with appropriate legislation, and it could involve the emergency evacuation, for example. It could involve, again, things that the state can actually legislate about where there's not preemption, and I think that's gonna be the issue. But I think conceivably around emergency plans and evacuation, some of the environmental issues as it relates to the state, and there are some, DEP knows that. So, I mean, I think that there will be an opportunity to work legislative and executive branch to craft some legislation. So I like the fact that it's pretty broad and open, because I think it gives us a lot of latitude.
And Joe, before your comment, I like, what John said is very accurate. This is the beginning. Think of this as a very good framework to start under. That's why it's so, I think, critical to get it done.
So long as that, in that light, that's good, because not only did Kevin's comment of economic development come up at the meeting we had on Tuesday, but my PSDAR work group, we've got that wording throughout our recommendations. We are very concerned about the economic impact of the closing of the plant, not just the loss of the annual pilot revenue, but the loss of all kinds of other revenue, which was contained in the UMass report, And by your mentioning that if we can have Jonathan, who wrote the UMass report, at some time later this year to go over it in detail with us, that's a very, very important issue for the town of Plymouth, as that economic impact and how we deal with it. It's a lot more than just the loss of the pilot revenue.
Yep, absolutely. Jess?
It seems to me that recommendation 1 and 2 really speak to the executive branch and the policy-driven side of things, right? So the agencies working together to be able to drive policy and protocol and process and how that's happening. Recommendation 3 is really legislative branch, right? So it's speaking to the legislative side of things. So I think as long as we have the policy side of the house covered and we also have the legislation side, the legislative piece covered, we have it's a two-prong approach. And I think that recommendation 3 on its own, maybe I would agree with some of the comments that we're hearing, but recommendation 3 along with 1 and 2 gives us a much stronger foundation. So I think that we need to look at it, all of the recommendations as a whole, instead of each one separately.
I agree entirely. Is there any other comment, and we'll
I
go
was
away?
just going to supplement, oh, I'm sorry.
No, look, Joe, go first, and then you, Joe.
Thanks. Really, two things. I think the concept is good and important, but I think we need to be clear on what the state's jurisdiction is. So wording like decommissioning oversight authority should be inherent in what the various agencies have in way of laws and rules for decommissioning the site. So to Entergy, I think it's important that we work together to establish, and maybe number 4 is the answer, but I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I'm not sure what oversight authority means in regards to whether it's a working group or an interagency. We're obligated to follow all regulations. Certainly, decommissioning is led by the NRC. It's a federally licensed facility, and then there's state elements that need to be factored in. So I have a problem with that. Second, in ensuring that Entergy have and maintain sufficient funds, that's inherent in what the NRC regulations. We have to have a minimum balance at all times. They have an obligation to come in and audit us, so I'm not sure what the state needs to duplicate what is already federal law. So those two things, I think, go beyond, what we already are obligated to do. So I'm not sure it's really worthy to be in here.
John?
I was just going to respond to that, just that thought, because I don't think my understanding of this recommendation, the intent is not to draft additional regulations. It's just to, within the existing framework, just to bring all the state agencies to bear to play the role that they play. It's not to add additional regulations. And I think that's what it's speaking to here. And it's, again, just a recommendation. We're just trying to set a course and a guide. It's not about adding more to the plate.
And I appreciate that, and I think if we were to clarify that, we would be on board to say that's exactly what we're trying to accomplish as well. We've got the experience in the industry doing decommissionings in Massachusetts and other states, and it didn't take, as Mr. Smith said, legislation to drive it. It took cooperation and working within the framework of what's already in place. In Vermont, for example, a lot of the framework still has to be created because it's their one and only nuclear power plant. In Massachusetts, it's the second.
Yeah.
So it really comes down to understanding what's already on the books, maybe tighten up what needs to be tightened up, and then kind of move forward. So if that's what's meant by this, that's not the way I read it.
That's my reading of that, and I was going to supplement a comment that Senator Wolf mentioned on deferring to me on the recommendation number 3, and it's really just it reflects really what we had. We had Senators Sear and DiMacedo, as well as Reps Muratori, and they presented a letter, as well as Representative Keating's office and Senators Markey and Warren. They spoke and they presented, they gave a letter to this panel, and I think we're trying to capture the role that the legislature plays here. They're critical, and of course, they're the ones that are are playing an important role here, and that's where we're getting some representation.
And I appreciate that, and
John, I'm gonna cut you off. Senator, you can,
I hope I
Yeah, I
didn't
mean, not
overstate
to-
my,
No,
my
no,
place
no.
here.
No, and not to look for a friction point,
yeah.
but there are some differences, this plant, between other plants that have been and will be decommissioned.
Absolutely.
Its location, its vulnerability to climate change issues, its unique geography relative to evacuation plans and emergency plans, should something happen. So it is possible that the executive branch, as they get into this, as the departments and agencies look at it, that they will find areas where the state actually does have jurisdiction which are not necessarily covered by NRC. As we looked at this, years, over the last, 6, 7, 8 years, there are emergency evacuation issues that the state uniquely is positioned to weigh in on, and there are environmental issues relative to impacts on the near-in marine environment. So, Joe, I understand your concern, and I think the concern is legitimate, because I do think that there may be areas where the state agencies are gonna look at it and say, we need to define this better, either through legislation or through regulation. So, I think what's here is intended, and I think it does leave the door open a little bit. And that, we're just gonna have to trust that the process is not gonna be overreaching, that's all.
Joseph?
I guess I was going to follow up, and Senator Wolf said it very well. We haven't even developed a plan. So we're making opinions, recommendations, objectives on something you haven't even seen yet. So before you say we need to have legislation to oversee certain factions of decommissioning, we should at least present our plan.
I would, I'm gonna close debate on this one in a moment, but I would point out to you, having been involved in the writing of this, that it says, develop and enact legislation, comma, as necessary and appropriate. We may all determine it's neither necessary nor appropriate to do it. I think the intention of this, again, is to create a framework for how we're gonna all work together. So with that, is there any motion to approve this?
So moved.
Second?
Second?
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Opposed.
No.
No.
So let's go on the record, Alan. David Noyes on behalf of John Nuremberger,
That's correct.
no? Paul Smith, UWA,
That's correct.
and Joseph Lynch opposed.
That's correct.
The motion passes. On to recommendation number 4, which fortunately for me is much shorter than the others. And I will try to do my best, Senator. This way I could never have been the clerk of the House.
You did great.
The NDCAP recommends that the state, through its interagency working group, with input from the NDCAP, the town of Plymouth, and other stakeholders, engage with Entergy with the goal of entering into a multi-year agreement between the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and Entergy and any successor on matters pertaining to the decommissioning of Pilgrim Nuclear Power Station. Any comments? Didn't think there would be. All in favor? Is there a motion, I should say?
Make a motion?
Is there a second? Second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Recommendation 4 passes unanimously. With that, and now we're a little ahead of schedule, and I hope that everybody can see the level of respectful concern and disagreement, but at the same time, unanimity of support for the leadership that's just been shown. It's truly been remarkable, so I want to thank everybody. But now we come to my personal favorite part of the day and evening, which is public comments. Is there, we've got 20 minutes allocated for it. Is there anyone in the public who would like to comment? 1, 2, 3. We have only 3 this evening that want to comment? Then you will each get a bonus minute of 7 minutes apiece. Who would like to go first tonight? Jim? Jim Lampert, just make sure you identify yourself.
Jim Lambert, and I would hope not to be anywhere near 7 minutes. I first had a question looking at these recommendations, and Sean, and I guess also probably John are best on it, is how, once the interagency group is formed, do people envision the role of this panel? Because one of the things I noted in the recommendations is that there is utterly no mention of funding for this panel.
Would you like me to address that?
Yeah. I think it's a fair question.
No, absolutely, we'll address it. If you take a look at the legislation, the intent in the legislation is to fund, and it's going to be subject to ongoing efforts by the legislature to help it. The panel has always been, and it's inherent in its name, an advisory panel. And our advisory role will continue throughout. And the input from everybody here, as well as you and everybody else, is not only welcomed by the administration, it's encouraged. And I see it as finally allowing us, once we've gotten through this first phase, to get down to really the advisory role. So whether it's on, after we learn a great deal more about the storage containers, and we learn more about the plan, that's when we will provide additional advice and counsel, because we've dug into it perhaps a little bit more broadly. So I'm very comfortable personally with this.
Well, let me pick up on that, because my problem is that it's funds to enable the interagency working group and state agencies. And one of the things I have heard many times listening to this panel is that you do not have the funds to even administratively to accomplish what this type of panel is required to do in terms of public records, in terms of what you're posting, in terms of handling the website, and there's no reason to go on ad infinitum. But the mere fact that you have an interagency working group, to me, does not mean you don't need funds for this panel.
I can tell you, Jim, in some level of granularity and detail, this discussion has been had, and the approach and the idea behind it is there is no mechanism for this organization, this panel, to actually administer any funds directly to begin with. There isn't. So in order to do that, what we need is, if we, as I think Rich said earlier, say we want to bring in an expert on a given topic for either a working group or the full panel, then we speak to our partners in the state and say, we really think we ought to. Now we've got, whether it's economic, whether it's public health, whether it's radiation, now we've got a vehicle to do it where hopefully the legislature will get funding for it, to say, now, if we need to bring somebody in, that's how we get it.
The hope would be that the interagency group would be funded and make use of its funding to make sure that you are able to do what you should do. Is that fair?
That is very fair, Jim, and it's also accurate. If you go back to the original legislation, the enacting legislation, it says that in it, basically.
Yeah, I mean, if I could even, and I totally understand and share what your concern could be, and I think that goes to the relationship between the interagency working group and us.
Yep.
The reason I'm thrilled by this is because if we had gotten resources, we never would have gotten the resources that would have involved on the multiple levels and across agencies, the kind of expertise we're going to get from who's currently here. We know that's not enough because we are funding additional, but this actually goes beyond us simply getting some money for our working groups to have more granularity. So I think, but at the same time, I do agree with what you're saying. We do need to understand the relationship between the working group and us, so that we don't become an outsider.
Yeah, exactly.
That we really have a good rapport and relationship.
Second question, and particularly with reference to recommendations 1 and 3, seem to involve a large number of things in which it's the Attorney General's office that is far more likely to have the expertise and the person power necessary to address such things as what is necessary and appropriate, where are the lines of preemption, what additional regulations can DPH or DEP or anyone else have the authority to enact. Is it envisioned that they would be part of this? Because are they part of the executive branch?
No.
That's my problem.
They are a separate constitutional office,
Right.
but if I may,
Please.
on behalf of the administration, we are, under the leadership of Secretary Beaton's office, reaching out to the Attorney General in asking whether there is interest to participate in this process. To the extent that the Attorney General is interested, they will be involved.
And I certainly hope that she and her group that's already on the nuclear side are.
We're in the process of reaching out, and if there's an interest, she will be involved.
Great. And I guess my third question is, how do people foresee public participation in terms of attendance at meetings of this interagency group, or frankly, knowing what's going on?
I think that it's no different than a regular working meeting that occurs in any state office today. That these may be working group meetings, that the public meetings will be here. This is where we will be working in public. The public does not have access on a daily basis to every meeting, so I don't really get it.
Well, I guess what I don't get either is the idea that frankly, the public should have no access
Oh,
to what
absolutely.
is going on here. So my question, I may badly have phrased it, is how do people see this working in a way that there will be an opportunity for real public suggestion, if not participation, commentary, thoughts that you can dismiss or not as you wish, but nonetheless may be valuable?
I can only say, Jim, speaking on behalf of the panel, that we always welcome and encourage you to come in, and we will be meeting 10 times a year for the foreseeable future for this very purpose.
More than the rest of my lifetime, sure. But the real question was directed not to how this panel will operate, but the interagency.
Well, and I can't speak on behalf of
Yeah,
them.
yeah.
I'm
It's not
just-
here yet.
Yes, that's right. I'm speaking on behalf of this administration right now, just being the lead for all the state agencies. I'm just one voice.
Thank you, Jim.
Did I use 7?
Yes, you did.
But other people spoke.
Yeah, they used some of your time.
Mary Lampert, I'm going to follow up on public participation because, and not with this panel, I'm referring to the new interagency group. I've worked in the past for, 5 years with the low-level waste management board that was making very important decisions, et cetera. They appointed a public participation coordinator to make sure that the public got information of what was happening, could attend some of the public meetings, and I think this should happen. Otherwise, I'm not comfortable. I'm plain not comfortable that the public will be knocked out and not able to have an avenue of dialogue with the interagency group. And I'm also speaking for a group that is being formed that includes all the major groups in this area: PERG, Clean Water, CLF, ELM, Sierra, PSR. And they're concerned and will become more active on how we're going to be informed and how you will hear our information. And I think that public participation coordinator was a very good idea that Carol Amick put in place, and that should be something of consideration as a friendly suggestion. This isn't for this panel.
Yeah.
This is for the interagency group. That's a different story.
Well, I'm not the chair, but I will, I'm
Please
just,
do.
on behalf of the administration,
Yeah,
just speaking
yeah.
here today, of course, we will consider all of this, and I think it will be treated exactly like we, just as
Absolutely.
Sean had mentioned, like any other public working group.
Absolutely.
We want this process to be as transparent and open and get the participation from the public, because that is exactly what's going to allow us to have the best process to get us to where we need to be.
Exactly. And so you will be indicating who the, who is the person to be in touch with?
Well,
or
this-
are we going from agency to agency?
I'm just speaking tonight. The lead on the interagency working group is Secretary Beaton's office, the Executive Office of Environmental Affairs. So there will be more guidance coming from the Executive Office on that. I will just say, I just know that all the state agencies that play a role here on this panel, as well as those to be involved, we will be actively involved, and we will, I know that this is an administration that cares deeply about transparency and public participation, and we will continue on that thread.
And the only thing I could add, Mary, to it is that, having been involved in many of these meetings, and I'm going to be very specific here, yours and Jim's thoughts, as well as many other people who are very passionate and committed to this for years, are well understood and known at the highest levels of the administration, and they're welcome and they're appreciated. So that will not change. I can't go back to it. I mean, I've worked in this Commonwealth in this kind of situation for 40 years. I've never seen this kind of leadership before. An open willingness to all the partners involved. It really is quite remarkable. So I understand your concerns. I'm sure they'll be addressed, but give it a little time. I mean, this is,
Oh, you know me, I want everything done yesterday.
well, Jim can speak to that later when he gets his rebuttal time.
Okay, I appreciate that.
I'm sorry for one second.
It does say that the department, and there'll be a lead designated
Yeah.
to coordinate the working group and be a liaison with us.
Exactly.
And I think as time goes on, we need to better understand the relationship
Absolutely.
between us and the working group.
Absolutely.
But it's my understanding and hope that that liaison will in effect be a part of this group. And
great
will be reporting out to us at every meeting
That is a great idea.
what the group is doing.
That's a great
And will be
idea.
able to receive public comment and our comment
Yeah.
through that process. Now, maybe we need to outline that better, or maybe as you
Yeah.
put together the group.
That's a
And
great idea.
also a liaison to the public.
Well,
We
yeah,
are
but
liaison.
these are open meetings with public comment. So
Absolutely.
my hope would be that we not overcomplicate it, but that we
Right.
use this
As a
as that
vehicle.
vehicle.
Yeah.
Now, that may be wrong. I don't
Because
know.
that's also part, Senator, of what the original enacting legislation requires us as a group to do.
Right.
Yeah, on recommendation 1, you have, and on the last sentence, other stakeholders. So that
Absolutely.
really means the
Yeah.
public.
It does.
So I was emphasizing that, and the idea of a public participation coordinator. You always hate to add one more person,
Yeah.
but it will make your life a lot easier.
Richard, thank you, Mary.
And as Richard is walking up, I just want to echo what Sean just said. Thank you to the Lamperts for your participation. I've not seen as many public processes as maybe many on this panel, but your involvement is amazing, and I encourage it, and I thank you for it, because it makes a difference in what we do and how we do it. So thank you for that.
Good evening, panel. Whoops.
Too strong.
Senator Wolf jogged my memory regarding recommendation 3, and it also ties in with recommendation 2 in terms of environmental and radiological monitoring considerations associated with emergency preparedness planning and funding. And I know our 2 select board members, Mr. Mahoney and Mr. Provenzano, have heard me say this since the mid-2000s, and Mr. Giarusso and Mr. Schwartz heard this too, and I had the opportunity to meet with MEMA discussing potential inadequacies of real-time radiological and meteorological monitoring within the 10-mile emergency planning zone distance that the NRC requires to be established in the unlikely event of a radiological emergency. And there's a lot of good generalities being discussed in recommendation 3. There's a lot of weeds that gets into a lot of this. I want to talk about one weed here that I'm professionally familiar with. I had the pleasure since about a dozen years ago interfacing with Suzanne Condon, who was the former head of the DPH, Bureau of Environmental Health, and I think she was the acting commissioner to the DPH, in terms of trying to have more than just Entergy's on-site meteorological tower data and Plymouth Airport data, the Weather Channel, to be used in the unlikely event of a radiological emergency. It took many years to get the DPH to come around and to get funding through Senator Murray's initiative at the time, and post-Fukushima was a good forcing function for the state, the DPH, to develop an enhanced real-time monitoring network off-site around the Pilgrim Plant, and also 3 sites in downtown Plymouth area, Colony Place. And Mary Lampert was instrumental too in getting funding from Duxbury so that another off-site station could be put near the harbor master. Nevertheless, I felt professionally that more could be done. When Suzanne Condon retired from the DPH, Jan Sullivan, I believe, took over her responsibility at DPH and would come once a year to the Nuclear Matters Committee in Plymouth and in Duxbury to give an update. The full program, at least if you want to call it the full program, was established in 2013, I believe. But since that time, even though there were plans to expand, it never happened, lack of funds from the state. Why is this important? A couple reasons. In the likely event of a radiological emergency, the staff manning the emergency operation facility on Aubrey Street and our EOC down in Cedarville need to be able to run their models, air quality dispersion models, to get reliable dose predictions. Why do you need reliable dose predictions? Well, the emergency planners need to be able to make informed decisions and recommendations to the governor about evacuation versus shelter in place. And even from energy standpoint, assuming they could get off the plant site and they didn't get caught in traffic trying to get out of Dodge, that they need to send field teams out with real-time radiation monitors. And I remember sitting in one of the emergency drills there and talking to some of the our police and other staff there, saying, you know what, you don't have to send the folks there. DPH has a real-time radiological monitoring station there. Send them where they're needed there, allocation of resources. So I'm just bringing this up from the standpoint that you have an operating plant for another year, but you're also going to have spent nuclear fuel in the pool for another 3 to 5 years thereafter, for the sake of argument, and you're going to have spent nuclear fuel stored in casks on site. I would like to see additional funds provided to expand this program if it's needed at that point. There's subject to debate. Some say yes, some say no. But it was going to be expanded, and it was lack of funds that prevented it from being expanded at the time. So I just wanted to bring this little weed to everybody's attention. I know some on this panel are very familiar with what I'm talking about from past years, but I just wanted to try to qualitatively educate people here who are not familiar with this. And there's a lot of other things that go into some of these other topics. Time doesn't permit to get into that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich. We've still got a few minutes. Are there any other public comments? No repeats, but any other public comments? Hearing none, then I'm going to ask for any new business from panel members. Anybody want to mention? Yes, Joseph.
Question.
Yes.
I thought that we were going to be discussing, or at least beginning discussing tonight, the findings and recommendations of the work groups. We discussed the 4 that were on the handout, and some of the findings and recommendations from the work groups, I'm sure, relate to these 4 in one way or another. But a lot of work has gone in to findings and recommendations by the work groups, and there's been no mention of when we're going to start that discussion. And I'm hoping that by the discussion and votes on these 4 doesn't mean that's it. And those are the only 4 that are going to be considered for inclusion into the report, because we haven't had that discussion yet.
Let me go back to the notes earlier. This is, and maybe I went through it too quickly or didn't miss the commas again. The plan at this point, to going backwards, is that the working groups, by June 5th, we will roll up all of the submissions in this format, including the typeface, and please don't change the margins. We'll roll it all up by June 5th, and at June 7th, we dig into every one of them and we start. That then in turn, on June 7th, in advance of that meeting, by the 15th, we take our second bite at the apple. It's an iterative process. All the comments, and this is strictly on the work group stuff, will come back in. Hopefully, I will be able to email back out to everybody by the 15th, which will be 5 days in advance of our June 20th meeting, the 3rd iteration of this. So, Joe, those are the 3, meetings where I really see we have an opportunity to dig in and talk about them at length. Okay? Any other thoughts?
We also
Yeah,
have
Rich.
to look at each recommendation, like, for example, there's a recommendation that Joe has on emergency preparedness coming out of the PSDAR. There's a similar recommendation in the Safety and Security Working Group. Our terminology is different from yours. We have additional stuff. You have others. So we've got to combine these first before we present them to everybody.
And if I could just, Kevin, I don't mean to pick on you, but what you and Joe have done with the, Kevin, are you paying attention to me? Sometimes. This whole idea of the language of the recommendations, can you just describe that for everybody else, because we do have a few minutes? What we talked about earlier in terms of how to describe the recommendations in principle, that whole discussion.
I'm not sure what you're getting at.
Joseph, remember, who were we talking to? Was it Dave? With Dave Nichols?
Yes.
About the phraseology. And this is just an open discussion.
And this came up at the Government Affairs meeting, and one of the things that we had talked about were, in our working group, was coming up with some principles that mirrored the legislative letter and the previous recommendations
Yeah.
that you put together. We actually put together some findings at our meeting that I can share
Yeah.
with you tonight.
Well, I
Or
don't think
can
we have
share.
time
Yeah,
tonight, but this is to the point Joe just made, that kind of discussion is saying, well, these are principles that support, or, we really need to dig into that, and the next two meetings are designed specifically for that.
And to, since I'm a part of that work
Yeah.
group also,
That's why I was surprised when you both played Mickey the Dunce on me, like you didn't know what I was talking about.
even the term principle versus recommendations was discussed and why.
Yeah.
And that'll be contained within the minutes, so that everybody else can be aware of why that was. It wasn't just wordsmithing,
Yeah.
there was a good reason behind the choice of that word.
Excellent. I will I'm sorry.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman,
Selectman?
I can't attend the next meeting on Thursday, June 7th. Mr. Selectman Provenzano will be pinch hitting for me. You can add me to that subcommittee with Mr. O'Reilly for the financial economic.
All right, hold on a second, let me get my
And-
sheet here.
I will copy Mr. Provenzano on those subcommittee potential meetings and all the emails that you send out with respect to the next meeting so that he's fully informed.
Bear with me for a second. So, which one is it, Selectman?
Financial economic.
Any other comments?
Question.
Yes, sir.
When do we envision the interagency group being set up?
I think I'm looking for guidance from Secretary Beaton and Environmental Affairs. I think we want to do it as promptly as possible, but
Yeah, the only thing I can add is that the Secretary's office has been terrifically engaged. So no one's talked about yet what the timetable is, because I think now that,
The reason I asked the question, Mr. Chairman, is that I think the report we're putting together, even though the legislation directs it to the general court and to the governor, we're starting that iterative process you're referring to with the working group.
Yeah.
This report is really a report that's gonna go to the working group. So it would be nice to know, sort of, to have some kind of framework for a time frame, but also a process by which this report sort of goes to the working group and gets embraced by the working group as part of their mandate as they, and I'm sure it will be. It'd just be nice to have a sense of how that's all gonna work out, because we're rushing to get this out, and I think
Yeah.
we should. I
Yeah.
think we set a year, and we should do that. But we should also make sure it's the best report possible now that we know it's going to be going to a working group.
Yeah.
We didn't even know that when we started this process.
so I can't answer tonight.
No, I don't
but
think anybody can.
We'll make sure we get back to you and others on timing for that process.
and I would have much preferred Kurt to be in the crosshairs of all these unanswerable questions. I
It
feel.
was,
Yes, Paul?
Question for the chair. So we're addressing these recommendations to the good governor, of course, but also to the Joint Committee on Telecommunications, Utilities, and Energy. Is that who we fall under, as opposed to, I mean, we always look to the DPU.
The
in
legislation.
years past.
We're doing what the legislation requires. That is specifically what the legislation requires us to report to. Now, we also have the mandate to distribute it as broadly and publicly for education as possible. So that will be part of it. But when I did the cover, I went back to the legislation, because that's who told us what we had to do, and that's who we got to report to. Pardon me?
Oh, I didn't see that.
Yeah, you'll see it. Go back, you'll read it, you'll see it there. Any other questions before I entertain a motion to adjourn? Hearing none? Is there a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Second? All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Thank you all very much. Thank you. Absolutely.
Next time we see each other, it'll be like.
Yeah.